Today we'll be writing our theme for the Rook. This piece looks very much like the turret of a castle, and we'll consider that as we develop our musical story. One of you was asking me how they might better harmonize a melody. So I've already written a very simple diatonic melody, and we're going to look at a strategy you might use to harmonize a melody. Let's just jump right in. As we've talked about in the past, understanding what you're writing before you write is very important. The story behind your piece, what you're trying to say. That informs every part of the composition process, from the melody that you write, to the chords that you choose to support that melody, to the dynamics, to the orchestration. Everything hinges on the initial idea. So what is that initial idea? Well, here you can see I have the title, The Rook, the Castle Stands. So our story begins with our heroes on a long journey home. They've been in battle in distant lands, and they've been victorious, but they don't know what the condition of their own land is, what their own castle is. So I imagine in these first 8 bars, they're walking and talking, and feelings of camaraderie have built up between them. There are a few figures here that look like fanfares, but they won't be treated that way through phrasing and through orchestration. And also, we're at a slower tempo marking here of quarter note equals 68. So I'm really after a feeling of warmth here. Starting in bar 9, I imagine that they come to a rise, and they start to climb this rise, and they know when they get to the top of the rise, they'll be able to see their castle in the distance. So through these 4 bars, we're building anticipation, till we get to the point where they crest the rise, and they see their castle in the distance, and they see these rooks, these turrets standing tall with flags flying. It's a really glorious and triumphant moment for them. Okay, let's hear that melody up to that point. Now let's harmonize this melody. And I want to focus on just the first 8 bars. We talked about how we're after a sense of warmth and camaraderie in these first 8 bars. It's a diatonic melody built in C major, so we're only going to use chords from the C major scale, the diatonic chords in the C major scale. And these are the diatonic chords. Now, to make this a little bit more challenging, we're only going to use 3 chords. We're going to use the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. And we're going to see what kind of emotions we can get out of using just these 3 chords with this simple diatonic melody. In the first 2 beats of measure 1, we have the notes C, G, C, and E. And all of those notes belong to our 1 chord, the C chord, which makes a lot of sense that we would start the piece with the tonic chord, the C major chord. So I've labeled that as C major. In the next 2 beats of bar 1, we have an F, a D, and an F. Predominantly it's an F throughout the bar with this very short 16th note D. So if we look in our chords, we can see that the 4 chord, the F major chord, is a good choice for this chord. Moving on to bar 2, the first 2 beats in bar 2 have an E, 2 C's, and a G. All of those notes belong to our C major chord, so I'll label that C. The next 2 beats predominantly have an A with this passing tone of a B natural, so A is the note that we'll be targeting here for a chord, and that belongs to our F chord. So I'll go ahead and label this as an F chord, F major. Looking at the next 2 beats of bar 3, we can see we have a C, a G, a C, and another G. So again, all of these notes belong to our C major triad. The next two beats have an F quarter note and an E quarter note. So we could decide to do this as an F major chord and then this second quarter note as a C major chord, but to keep my harmonic rhythm of 2 beats per chord, I'm going to label this F major for now. Moving on to the next measure, we have a D, 2 Gs and a D, and this lower neighbor tone of a C going back up to a D, and finally a B. So this collection of notes suggests a G major triad for the entire bar. And if we want to keep the harmonic rhythm of 2 chords per measure, we could always make this first G a G sus4, and then have it go to a G triad for the second half of the measure. And I think that's in the spirit of using just the 1, 4, and 5 chord. All right, let's listen to what we have so far. I'm just going to sing the melody and play the chords here. Da, 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 da. Yes, those chords support that melody, even though I was playing simple root position voicings. And you know, I'm going to stop using that word simple. I called the melody simple too, and that kind of diminishes what we're doing here. There's nothing simple about writing a diatonic melody. We've heard them all our lives, and in some ways, to come up with something new and fresh that represents what you're trying to do using these diatonic chords and this diatonic melody is more difficult in a way. Okay, let's look at how we can take these, quote, simple chords and get more emotion out of them. I've taken the time to write in the chords in the next 4 measures in the same method that we did for the first 4 measures. I did use that G sus4 to G movement that we talked about in bar 4 and also in bar 8. You'll also notice that I have these slash chords now written in this piece. And those are what we're going to be talking about as far as how to get some more emotion out of your chords. We still have just C, F, C, F, C, F, G. And I did also add in this C chord on the E that we talked about. So if I play these chords like I did when we were first testing them out, as block chords in root position, they sounded like this. C to F, to C, to F, to C, to F, to G. And that's fine, but I'm just rocking back and forth with the same voicings all in root position, so there's not a lot of emotional content to that. But if I were to play them as they're written now, just the first 3 chords here, that's got a lot more emotion to it, just using these inversions. So let's look at the lines that are created using these inversions. If we look at the bass notes of these chords, we can see that we've created this downward line. And that's possible because of the inversions we're using. So we start with our C chord in root position with C in the bass, then we move to our F chord with an A in the bass. So it's in first inversion, so the third of the chord, the A is now in the bass. Then we move down stepwise to our C chord in second inversion with G in the bass. We move down stepwise again to an F on our F chord, so it's in root position. Then we go to our C chord with our E in the bass, and then finally our F chord with the 5th in the bass, the C. So those inversions allow us to write this nice downward line. In the second half of the melody, we've moved the opposite way, again using inversions. So we go from a C, this passing note of a D, to an E, our C chord in first inversion, to an F, our F chord in root position, then a C over G, so our C chord in second inversion, then our F over A, our F chord in first inversion, and then to our G. And even though we're still playing these as block chords, we have a more interesting melody in our top line. Let's listen to these chords now and how these inversions have added emotion and a sense of direction. Now let's listen to those chords with the melody and see if they better support that feeling of camaraderie. So that makes an enormous difference. And it shows that just these three chords, our 1 chord, our 4 chord, and our 5 chord, there's a lot more to them than meets the eye. All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish off the rest of the piece. I'm going to allow myself to use all of our diatonic chords, and we'll come back and take a look at that. In the first 8 measures of the piece, we use just 3 chords. The 1 chord, a tonic chord, the 4 chord, a subdominant chord, and the 5 chord, a dominant chord. For the rest of the piece, I'm allowing myself to use all of the diatonic chords. So let's see how I've used them and how they're functioning. The first new chord I use from our list of diatonic chords is the 7 diminished chord, this B diminished chord. It has a dominant function, typically leading back to the 1 chord. I first tried to use this B diminished chord to lead to our 3 minor chord, the E minor chord. There's a very strong bass movement of a 5th from the B to the E. But because this next section we're entering represents our heroes climbing a rise, I felt like this movement from B diminished to E minor instead felt like a downward movement. It didn't have a lift to it. So instead, I decided to go to an E major chord. And that definitely has that feeling of upward motion and uplifting feeling moving to the E major. The B diminished is still acting with a dominant function, it's just now helping us to temporarily modulate up to E major. That means that this A minor chord, though it shows up in our list of diatonic chords, the 6 minor chord, it could also be thought of as the 4 minor chord of E major. This next chord, the G major, also shows up in our list of diatonic chords. It could either be seen as the 5 of 1 in C major or the flat 3 major of E major. Either way, it helps us to modulate back to the key of C major. So here's a harmonic analysis of the piece we're looking at. And this would be our B diminished chord. I know it says B minor 7 flat 5 here. That's because there's an A in the melody, and I took that into account while I was analyzing this. But just consider this B diminished. So this would be B diminished in the key of C, and what this is telling us here is that in the key of E, it would act as a dominant sound leading to the key of E. So this resolves to the E chord and it tonicizes it, so now we are in the key of E major here, so it considers this chord the 4 minor chord, not the 6 minor of C, but the 4 minor of E. Then this chord is both the flat 3 of E and the 5 chord of C, modulating back to the key of C major. I hope this type of harmonic analysis is helpful and not more confusing. But it's really important to understand how your music is functioning. And for some people, they may see this E major chord as a secondary dominant, the 5 of 6 leading to A minor. But for me, I hear it as a modulation to E major and then a modulation back to C major. And that's how I understand how this music is functioning, which helped me to write it. Okay, let's listen to it through that modulation and up to here. We'll back up a little bit and see if that modulation seems smooth and if it gives us that uplifting feeling. Alright, moving on, we have a D minor chord and a C major chord, both from our diatonic collection of chords. And then we have this unusual looking chord, a D flat over F, and it's labeled N6. So what does that mean? The N6 designates that this is what's called a Neapolitan chord. The Neapolitan chord comes from the parallel minor. It's the minor 4 chord with a lowered 6th degree. So instead of being F, A flat, C, it would be F, A flat, D flat. But there's a much easier way to construct this chord. Since we're in the key of C here, we start with our C major scale, and then lower the 2nd degree of the scale from D to D flat. Next we build a major triad based on that lowered 2nd degree. So this would be D flat, F, and A flat, a D flat major triad. And then we put the 3rd of the chord, the F, in the bass. You might remember that when we first looked at the melody, it was fully diatonic. And now we have these A flats and D flats in the melody to work with this Neapolitan chord. The reason I chose this chord here is because we're building anticipation as they climb the rise to see what condition their castle is in. And as they get nearer to the top, there's a bit of trepidation. And I think that this Neapolitan chord really represents that. The Neapolitan chord came into vogue in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was quite often heard in classical music, and it's what's known as a predominant chord, meaning that it comes before the dominant chord. So here you can see that we have our Neapolitan chord, then we go to our 5 chord, our dominant chord. Now sometimes between those two chords, you'll see what's called a cadential 6/4 chord, which is the 1 chord in 2nd inversion. I've approached this Neapolitan chord with a 1 chord in 1st inversion, and that will give some nice voice leading possibilities when we orchestrate this. Let's listen to this build-up section where they're climbing the rise to see the condition of their castle, and see what this Neapolitan chord adds to the emotions of this section. Moving on to the next 4 bars, this is where we see that our castle still stands. So it's going to be a big triumphant moment. I'm sure it will feature brass and possibly high strings. I've left it somewhat sparse in the writing here because I want to experiment with things as I move into the orchestration. So for now I've got a tonic pedal, the C pedal underneath all of this. That may change. In the last 5 bars, I've approached it very much like I did the beginning of the piece as far as the chords go, but in orchestration it will be a bigger sound. And then we return to a callback of our Neapolitan chord as we move through our final cadence. All right, I think it's time to listen to the entire piano sketch for the Rook, the Castle Stands. I hope you'll join me for the orchestration of this piece, and I'll see you all next time.